Could I this issue? Oh, sorry. Could I ask the issue of just using money to estimate policy? There is, and I want to ask these statisticians on the table, and you perhaps. There was the individual deprivation measure developed with 15 measures of poverty. It's food, water, shelter, health, education, energy, sanitation, family relationships, clothing, environment, voice in the community, term use, respect, freedom, all of these 15 measures. Now, is there any way that these brilliant economists and statisticians can package this up into something that is meaningful for those who are working to alleviate poverty and advocating to alleviate poverty in the field? Because unless you address these issues, I don't think we'll have really a meaningful understanding of what poverty means to the real people that we're supposed to be talking about. I'm Fadla from Muslim Aid, by the way.
Thank you very much. I mean, it struck me in this conversation also that we haven't heard very much about the way in which poor people themselves define poverty. I mean, obviously the World Bank did the sort of, I still think, one of the best pieces of research I've seen in development, the Voices of the Poor project, which really tried to get at this question. But I'm interested that this hasn't come very much into our conversation about the poverty metric yet. Perhaps it will do shortly. Any other questions, comments? Over there, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ibrahim Yahuza. My question is to the first speaker, and the question is about this last slide that shows that poverty is more prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. The question first is, do you think it's right to categorize sub-Saharan Africa as a group and say sub-Saharan Africa poverty? You should know that countries such as Nigeria and maybe South Africa, you can't compare them with some other countries. So I think it's more appropriate, rather than chunking all the countries in Africa and just say sub-Saharan Africa, if there are way you can split it into some countries that have more means and others. That's one. Secondly, do you think you trust the data? Because I don't think that data seems right, that it was so skewed, because I'm not an economist, but I can see, if I look at CNN or whatever, the things that you say that poverty, I can see that in other continents. So it doesn't suggest to me that the data is right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to come on to questions about the quality of data in the next panel, although do feel free, people on this panel, to comment on that if you like. Now, I know, I think David Piershaw, did you have a question for the last panel that we thought was probably also usefully addressed here? I'm remembering somebody had a question.
Well, passed on. Well, it's really very much what Francis Stewart's been saying, but if you break it down into what happens within households, that almost all the data is household data, yet what happens to individuals within households is very different, particularly between men and women, and to some extent within children, for children. So presenting the results as for individuals, when in fact it's about households, is a huge distortion, and it's very difficult to make progress on that. But if one's trying to focus on extreme poverty, I think it's fair to say we have made no progress in the last 50 years on that. Though Dean looks very sceptical about that. So it remains a problem, and if one's trying to identify what we mean by extreme poverty and focus on tackling it, it does change the target very substantially.
Thank you. I can see you, gentleman behind you, wants to ask a question, but I'm going to hold that, if I may, till the next round. and just invite the panel to come back. So we have a question really following up from Francis's presentation, talking about broader measures of deprivation and how they could be used as a sort of complement substitute to the income measures that we use. And then lots of interesting questions about classifications, country classifications by region, by income level, questions about data quality, and then questions about what are the units of measurement here, and how appropriate is it to kind of assume that what we measure in one unit we can translate in a household unit, we can translate across to the individual. Let me perhaps go back in the order in which people spoke. So Dean, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So let me address first the question that was directly addressed to me about the quality of the data and the aggregation at Sub-Saharan Africa region. I'll give two fairly quick responses to both of those questions. The first is in terms of the aggregation at the regional levels. I suspect that comment could probably be made about most of the regional aggregations that we're making, that there's probably useful disaggregations within many of the regions that we're looking at. And part of the reason that we have an online tool, a PovCalNet tool that's been available for many years, is that it does allow people to do their own aggregations as they see fit. So you can get country-specific poverty estimates and aggregate as seems sort of appropriate to the types of questions that people are asking. So to some extent, it's a little bit of a dodge, but I think it's also the correct response in the sense that these all of the sort of underlying data are available for people to use in a way that they find most useful to their needs. And that second question of do you trust the data, you most likely don't want to hear me say yes, I do. That's that's probably not the answer that you're looking for. But let me say that on that extent, I think part of what we've been producing over the years, but in particular, I've been involved in two tasks over the last 2 years, which have been, last year we released a policy research report which was about measuring poverty, that talked about both national and global poverty measures, but it really drills down into all of the details of all of the data inputs and the issues related to the data quality. And it had a real strong focus not on sampling error, but on non-sampling error, which I think is the key quality dimension of this task. And we spent a long time talking about quality of census data, which is a necessary input, quality of the household survey data, quality of the inflation data that's used. And in that report, I think we provide sort of reasonable senses of the sensitivity of the estimates to the types of errors that we do observe in the data and that we are aware of. And so I'd refer people to that policy research report, a measured approach to, I think if you just Google a measured approach and World Bank, you'll come up with the policy research report on that. But similarly, the working paper that we've released with these new global poverty estimates spends a lot of time talking about the data quality issues. And I think those are real. And when we're engaged in a conversation now about investing more in data and trying to fill data gaps, we really want to emphasize that filling data gaps doesn't just mean collecting more data. It means improving the quality of data is an equally important element of that discussion. And so we think that's a really important message to be getting out there. I'll also mention one other report. So I was just at a launch for a report that focused on ending poverty in Africa, so ending poverty in a rising Africa. And that was a World Bank report. And they spent a lot of time sort of drilling down into the details, the country details of the ones that they knew best. And in fact, they argued that when they looked at some of the global poverty estimates, they felt that more detailed analysis would give a different story, and sort of looked at this with a greater lens and greater focus. And I think that's also a really useful document to look at in terms of thinking about data quality, but it's also important to recognize that the task of doing global poverty measurement by nature looks different than if you drill down into a particular region. And we think that's important to acknowledge, and I think there's sort of documents out there that discuss that. All right, so that's the end of that question I claimed I would answer quickly. I'm happy to attack the other two, but maybe better if I allow some of the colleagues to speak, and then I can jump in if...
Thank you very much. Very considerate. Espen.
Hi, thanks. I think I'll just quickly comment on 2 points. I think Martin is in a better position to comment on monetary versus multidimensional and so on, but I will just quickly challenge this notion that we haven't made any progress in the way we're monitoring poverty globally. I think and also at national level, I think we do have just an incredible amount of data now that we did not have 30, 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago, or 10 years ago. Just in the last few decades, the availability of microdata has just really increased, but there's still a lot of issues with it, and especially regarding comparability across countries. And it's very, very hard in itself to make comparabilities across countries simply across simple dimensions like consumption and income, including other dimensions, and doing that comparably is across countries is difficult within the micro household surveys. But when we do analyze monetary poverty, we do in the country context, in national poverty assessments, we do focus a lot more on that. But it's hard to do this cross country. But there are some dimensions to create harmonized databases on this also within the bank, and we are definitely moving in that direction and want to do that better. But there are some serious data limitation in that regard. And then second, I just wanted to quickly respond to Francis' point that, and reference to this blog post which from Center for Global Development last year, which showed that these new data led to halving of poverty. I mean, that was that analysis was basically changing the threshold of poverty in all poor countries dramatically down, which led to much poorer count. What we tried to do here is not specifically to keep the head count constant, but we tried to keep the value of the poverty line in the poorest countries in the world as constant as possible while incorporating this price data. And we believe that's a much more correct way of doing that. And last, also just a thing about the low-income, middle-income country thresholds, that they are in fact not using purchasing power parities. It's just a comment on that there are a lot of other weaknesses with, and maybe that's one of the weaknesses of these thresholds, but they're not affected. So countries' classifications have not jumped as a result of the purchasing power parities in terms of making more countries middle-income or not.
Thank you very much. Martin, let's come back to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions and comments and interesting discussion. I'll come back to Francis at the end, but just a few points. Intra-household, the point is well taken. And in fact, the question there was almost exactly the topic of the paper I'm working on. What are the implications of the existence of intra-household inequality for how we target in social policy, and how far do we get it wrong? If poverty is obviously about individuals, and we're using household aggregates, but how much does it really matter? So watch this space. This is intensive data work for Sub-Saharan Africa using DHS surveys, where for women we can get at anthropometric measures in a way and get a window on intra-household distribution in a way that we can't get normally. But there's a lot ahead before I can give you a clear answer. On social subjective, but I'm sympathetic with the point. On social subjective poverty lines, we didn't talk about that, but that's a huge area of poverty analysis now, where we try to anchor. In fact, I find it very credible. As Francis mentioned, I've done work on this over 15 years, but if you want to, the best single concept of poverty, and Francis posed that question, I would argue in any given society, it's the point above which people tend to think they're not poor, and below which they tend to think they're poor. Mm-hmm. It's entirely specific to that society, and that's the social subjective poverty line. Social subjective poverty lines can be calibrated to data. It's not difficult. You have to ask the right questions in surveys, and you have to be sensitive to problems of measurement error, as always. But it's quite a well-defined concept. actually, the social subjective poverty lines don't look terribly different to objective poverty lines. They actually sync up quite nicely. But where it looks very different is in the poverty profile. Subjective poverty lines tend to be different in terms of the types of people. And demographics, and this links back to the intra-household issue, demographics of the household is one area where we do see a disconnect between the objective and the subjective. For example, objective poverty lines tend to show that larger households are poorer, so subjective poverty lines do not show that. We don't see any relationship. I can go into why that's the case, but I don't have much time. On composite indices, I don't see the point at all of adding up. If you've got your 15 indices, I don't see the point of adding them up in some arbitrary way. I want to see that dashboard. I think of it as like if I'm driving my car and you tell me, oh, it'd be really nice to aggregate all the instruments I use in driving my car, the speedometer and the whatever else. Actually, I don't have a driver's license, so this is a crazy example. But you know, I can imagine. And you put it all in this composite index and you tell me that's a better way to drive my car. My goodness. I just don't understand why people do this. In policy all the time, and I'm working with policymakers a lot, I see they don't want the composite index. They want to know what it is about. Is it health, or is it education that I should be focusing on, or is it income poverty? This brings me back to Francis. Francis, what is not meaningful about living on $1 a day? It's like, how can you say that's not meaningful? Try doing that. The people I know who who are that poor, they find it very meaningful. It is very real concept. We shouldn't hide from it. It doesn't mean it's everything about welfare. Of course it's not. And that's why we need other indicators. And all the things you talked about, we already measure. And we look at those things. And we should be looking at those things. Because our household-based consumption or income poverty measure is incomplete. Fully agreed. Nobody's ever disagreed with that, to my knowledge. No sensible person could. But it is one of the things, and it's a very important thing, and we should be looking at it certainly without any apology. Another point, why do we say that if a poverty measure, an income poverty measure, is not correlated with some other non-income dimension, why do we say that the income poverty measure is not reliable? I don't understand that. It's actually kind of good news if it's not correlated. That means we bring more information by combining the two indices. If they're perfectly correlated, the world would be not very interesting. We just need one of these indices, whichever it happens to be that we choose. But the lack of correlation is really important. That's how we learn. In one country, it's about income poverty. In another country, it's about health and education. That's part of the policy dialogue of how we fight poverty broadly defined. On the point about monetary poverty, that many people made this mistake, in my view, when we measure poverty is using in a space of income or consumption, we're not saying that income or consumption is the only thing that matters to your welfare. The poverty lines should be anchored to a concept of welfare. That concept of welfare can be very broad. That's why I emphasize the social effects on welfare. If you think of poverty as welfare as a function of not just your own income, but your relative income in a given society, then the poverty line must vary with the mean of that society. And that just follows automatically. That broader concept of welfare is what we should be anchoring our measures of poverty to. And that was the message of my main talk. And Espen has already addressed this point that I was going to raise about the halving overnight. But that was a very dubious calculation. We knew right from the start that calculation by colleagues of mine at CGD, that calculation was questionable. They had actually lowered the poverty line dramatically and told us that this is halving due to the ICP. We knew that was wrong from day one. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Right, Francis.
Right. Well, I don't hold any weight to the halving or the non-halving. That was an aside, so to speak, but clearly a provocative aside. On the bigger issue, first we had the question of, can you put these numbers together? Well, you can have a dashboard, as Martin said, but it is complicated to look at a dashboard. And I must say, as a driver, I'd love it if there was only one indicator. And that's why we have automatic cars. And of course, that's what these monetary poverty measures are doing. They're giving you one indicator. And that's why one's concerned with them, because one is focusing on them and ignoring the intra-household and the other deprivations. So you can put the deprivations together, and not just have the dashboard. And I have colleagues who have devised a way of doing that, and there are many other ways of doing it. So yes, you can do it. And the question is, should we, or should we have a dashboard? And I think what we're trying to do is people are deprived in a set of, let's say, capabilities, things they'd like to be and do. They're deprived, there are a whole range of them, and some of them are very important and some of them are less important. And we're trying to get at some things which are very important. What's the best way of measuring that set? Is it just a monetary indicator? No, it is not. And that's where the correlation matters, because it shows that it is not. Would there be a better way of doing it? Well, maybe the dashboard would be the better way of doing it. And yes, along in that dashboard would be that dollar, because people would like to have that dollar for all sorts of reasons, and that's important. But there would, by having the dashboard, you have a dashboard related to individuals, which gets to the household point. Because if you say what is, nutrition is one of the things in the dashboard. Clearly that's related to individuals. You automatically know what's happening within the household, other women being more malnourished than the men and so on. Education, these all things that belong to the individual, so you get at them. So that's what we should be aiming for. Now the question is, what's the best way of getting to this broad range of capability deprivations? Is it to get PPP, or is it to try and move towards having that on the one side, but all these other things, but equally centrally important? The problem is, at the moment, though everyone says, oh yes, we look at money, but of course we're looking at all the other things too. It's not really happening. The headline is always the monetary poverty, and that's why I'm concerned that we should broaden it out and think what we mean, because money, above all, is a single indicator which adds everything together through prices and things which we know don't really reflect appropriate marginal utilities given the way the world's income is distributed, etc., given externalities, given all the problems with money, which are, huge. They don't represent a real good way of putting welfare together. So could we look for something better? That's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Frances. Now, we're nearly out of time, but I'm conscious that I've already lined up one question for the next round. I'm also aware that we've had a very big male bias towards the questions in this round. So if any women would like to ask a question, I will make an exception and push ourselves slightly over time. We have one more session, so there will be time for more discussion on these issues. So let me start with you, sir, and then I'll come over here. If people can be very, very brief, please. You're eating into your own tea time.
I don't want a cup of tea, but anyway.
Other people do.
I'm going to pick up on that comment you made at the end of the formal session of speakers, as if it was a bit of a joke about Ronald Reagan and eliminating poverty measurement. I think if we think of the last 100 years, I think we think of, we can explain why there weren't any statisticians or econometricians in the Soviet Union, because of Vygotsky, Lysenko refusing randomized experiments, and other things like that. So there were literally no statisticians. When you talked to a Soviet, he said there were 20 million statisticians in the Soviet Union. He meant people who counted in different provinces. There weren't any statisticians. Another good example of two.
Sorry, you got a question. I need to keep it very brief.
Sure.
I really apologise. You can have a chat in the tea break.
Okay. Well, now the question is, I'll leap to the end because I think I'll give another example. The end is to say that I think it's interesting that we have a lot of national poverty assessments in local income countries, but I think the reason is, the negative reason is related to a publication of ODI about 10 years ago by Booth and Luskis, and what Lewis Crouch says is that countries are quite happy to accept external funding for these national poverty assessments, but they don't use them, not locally. As one of the speakers said, we have a huge amount of data, but it's not used nationally or locally. So I think that we've got unused material. So what are we going to do about that, is the question.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to that in the next session, the questions about what data is collected, what are the data gaps, and who is driving some of that, and what people use the data for. So I hope we'll certainly encourage people to answer that on the panel, but I think we'll also come back to a lot of those questions in the next session. Okay, I see two people here. Very quickly, please. Thank you.
I was wondering, particularly for Martin, you talked a lot about increasing the number of measures we use and increasing the dashboard, and I was wondering to what extent, how you thought that weighted against increasing engagement and losing focus, or whether you actually think that increasing the dashboard could help increase engagement because it would feel more relevant.
Interesting.
Hi, my question is to Professor Francis. You said that we need to move beyond the poverty line, the monetary poverty line, and think more about putting other deprivation measures to the poverty line, which we already have. Do you think that the empowerment line, which has recently been designed by the McKinsey Global Institute, serves the purpose here?
Thank you very much indeed. This is clearly a conversation which will run and run. We also have one question which is an important point that hasn't been raised yet from the online audience, which is about the fact that we haven't yet talked about inequality and whether we want to add a sort of inequality dimension to the measures of poverty. I think Martin obviously touched on that in the graph about the floor and the mean. But whether we want to more explicitly add an inequality dimension to this. So let me go in reverse order this time and invite Francis to respond and anything last remarks you'd like to say in the way of summing up. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I don't know the McKinsey Empowerment Index, so I can't really comment, but I do think that empowerment is a very important thing to have, and therefore lacking it is an important deprivation, so it should be in our broader definition.
Thank you. Martin.
Thank you. The two questions that I guess pertain to me, the relevance of multiple indicators to this. I actually think bearing something important in a composite is not good for raising consciousness about that factor. I think raising consciousness about something is to measure it explicitly and put it out there and show people what it involves. So I'm sympathetic with the two parts of the two options. I'm sympathetic with your second, more sympathetic with your second. On inequality, of course, inequality is hugely important to what happens to poverty, and it's important in its own right. We understand now that inequality in various dimensions, certainly not just income dimensions, inequality is one of the reasons why progress against poverty can be slow. It not only means that we see less growth, and that's clear, I think, from the evidence so far, it also means that the growth we see is less poverty reducing. It's identifying what the specific dimensions of inequality are relevant in that country context. That's the real challenge. And in one country, it's very different to another. But inequality as a generalized idea is hugely important to progress against poverty and other things. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
I'll pass in the interest of time.
Oh dear, now I feel bad. Dean.
Sure, let me give maybe take on two of these. One comment I do want to make is that there's been a lot of discussion today about this notion of the multidimensionality of poverty, and there is disagreement clearly about whether or not to aggregate the multidimensional aspects of that. But I do think it's super important to step back and realize that every single speaker today has emphasized that poverty should be based on monetary and non-monetary dimensions of poverty. And really that's, in my mind, that's a critical kind of decision to be made, that we should be looking at the many different dimensions of well-being. And I kind of wanted to really emphasize that, because we can tend to overstate the differences on these things of whether or not to weight and aggregate as opposed to the dashboard. But this notion that we're all talking about the same underlying data inputs and measures is really important. On this last comment, I kind of can't leave hanging this notion that countries are glad to have national poverty assessments to sort of get the money, but they don't really use them. I can only speak from my experiences, but I think the way, I think analytical work proceeds in a couple of different ways. And one is, I think you do analytical work and you change the nature of conversations. And over time, there's this accretion of evidence and people start thinking about policy in a different way. So oftentimes it is challenging to attribute one particular research paper that changed a particular government policy. And so we can sometimes walk away thinking, that work has changed nothing. But it has oftentimes, if it's helped to change the way that people think about it. But in addition to that, I know that in many countries that I've worked in, it's I'll go into government office. So when I worked in Bangladesh, I was always surprised by every time I'd walk into a government office, there would be a picture of a poverty map on the wall, and the policy of Bangladesh deeply embraced targeting policies based on that poverty map. Now, we can talk about the details of the analytics behind that. But to argue that analytical work and the data collection hasn't influenced policy would just be radically a wrong interpretation of what I was viewing in every single office, where these poverty maps really were used exactly for targeting of social assistance funds across the countries. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we've had such a rich discussion. I mean, I'm particularly pleased that we managed to combine a really sort of deep discussion, both of the production of these figures, but also of their use. And I think we've straddled really nicely kind of what poverty lines and the poverty numbers look like from the perspective both of the producers and of the users, of what they're for. So I think that's been a fantastic discussion that's set us up nicely for when we tear this all down in the next session by talking about how terrible the data is on which all of this discussion has been based. But anyway, a big hand to the speakers. Thank you very much.